The second state of consciousness we're going to talk about is the other primal state. So primates generally exist in two states. Dying, not dying, right? So we're not in our not dying state. I call this a surviving state. I'm going to survive today, right? The tiger's not chasing me. My relationships are okay. I have my job. I have a home to live in. So all the things that make me feel safe are okay today, right? Even if they're not perfect, they're okay enough that I don't feel like a tiger's chasing me. I didn't do that. The brain chemical that's released is serotonin. So, in fact, I call serotonin the I'm not dying chemical. So it's released through the digestive system. We'll talk a little bit more about body systems, but serotonin is what's released, and we enter what's called a rest and digest state, right? So this is when basically we're not being chased by that tiger. We're okay. We've reached primal homeostasis, and we feel safe and well. Now we're going to go into rest and digest and what the body does when we enter that rest and digest state. So this is how you should feel after you've done a practice. So if you're triggered, one of the things I say a lot is I recommend not using this process or this information just to handle triggers. There's going to be some foundational stuff I recommend in changing the way your brain function works. But when you're in a triggered state, after doing the practice, you should feel what I'm going to talk about. If you don't, do a different practice. Don't give up. We were talking about this last night after the meetup. Well, I tried it and it didn't work. Then you try something else. You keep trying. It's worth it. Everything I say, because sometimes fight or flight mechanisms can feel good. Righteous indignation is one of the worst. It's like when you have a right to be angry, right? Or have a right to feel a certain way, we'll stay in that. But we have to ask ourselves the questions, is it worth dying for? Because anytime I stay in a state of suffering, I'm in a dying process. My body is aging and dying.
I just wanted to mention, based on what you said, there's those people who say, I love adversity, right? Mm-hmm. Because it makes me feel stronger. Or those people who are like, I love stress because they get that adrenaline rush and they start studying harder. You would probably recommend like not to go that route, right? Like,
well, they don't. So if it's a stress feeling, sometimes people don't use the words the words that they're using won't correlate. So for example, if they're feeling like it's going to make them work harder, that's motivation, which is a different brain function. Okay. They're calling it stress, okay, but it's not as much an adrenaline rush. An adrenaline rush comes from threat of imminent death. Okay. So it is always a trigger. Now, some people do start to like the feeling of it because they do feel stronger. Because if we're the weak gazelle, if we're the one being chased by the tiger, we want someone else to be weaker than us. We want to gain position some way. So sometimes people will use it to motivate, like adrenaline rushes and stuff. And I'm going to talk about why that happens as we talk about the prefrontal cortex, So it's kind of like a lot of times, though, people that what we're experiencing when we're remaining in a fight or flight is a state of suffering. Now, if the person has to have the adrenaline rush to feel alive, then that means that whenever they don't have it, they feel dead, which is a state of suffering. So it's kind of like picking through all those little, realizations of it. And it's finally coming to understand, like we've talked about before, that some people don't even know they're suffering. They have low-level stress all the time. They have no idea they're suffering. They think it's fine. Yeah, well, and it's a natural state if they've had it their whole life, especially if it's an adopted condition, right? So it's going to vary depending on the individual. So we really have to start to get to know. And this is the thing I talk about. You want to start using your life as a gauge. So the mood I'm in isn't about the conditions. It's about whether or not I'm triggered. And I can start using that to gauge and say, well, if I'm feeling any state of suffering, that means I'm triggered. I want to get out of that, rather than blaming the condition and saying, well, of course I feel that way because this happened, or, right, because then we're just keeping ourselves, and it ends up we give our power away to that condition. Yes. So what the body does as we come out of it is, on a physical level, we still have an enlarged amygdala. So when we've entered a rest and digest state, we haven't altered the amygdala. the amygdala is still ready because it's like, okay, well, yeah, you're in rest and digest now, but I have to be prepared for the next trigger. And so the amygdala is still enlarged. So we're still subject to a fight or flight response when we're entering a rest and digest state. Now the systems are back on, but they're not at their peak. So we're going to feel better. And so this is why I always say I call serotonin the I'm not dying chemical, because it not dying feels better than dying. And for some people, that's the best we feel. That's the best I felt. I was in fight or flight 90% of the time, rest and digest 10%. And I had no idea what thriving was. I had no idea. I couldn't even conceive of the concept. So those rest and digest moments for me were gold. That was life being good, the best it could get, right? So it does feel better, but we're not in peak performance at this level. We are still dependent on the practice, right? So if I'm counting on the whatever I'm going to get myself out of my fight or flight state, I am now dependent on that thing to get me out, right? So there's still a dependency there. So what I want to talk about is understanding dependency and the addictive cycle, what's really happening in the addictive cycle. And I'm going to explain, having been a severe addict, was a severe addict for the majority of my early life. And so I've been on both sides of the coin, and it is not about dopamine. Dopamine is released, and the reason why is survival. The body's trying to heal from the damage of some addictive chemicals and stuff like that. But I'm going to talk about what's really happening, what addicts are really seeking. And it's huge, and it helps us break addiction wide open and make it curable rather than a lifelong condition. So what's happening is the addictive cycle is you're having a sensory trigger occur, right? So some sight, sound, taste, touch, smell is combined with some memory, yours or some ancestral memory, and you've entered a high state of suffering, right? So here I am, my life is stressed, or my life is sad, I'm depressed, I'm angry, whatever. I'm in my state of suffering. What happens is the brain wants to relieve that suffering, right? Because first of all, it's killing us. Second of all, the suffering is causing damage to our body. That stress state is causing damage. So what's been classified as reward systems, and now this can work in primates. Primates can be trained in reward systems, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But what it is self-medication. Most advanced medical communities now call addiction self-medication, right? It is not a malfunction of the brain. The brain is dying, and it wants to not be dying. So addiction is not about pleasure. It's about, I'm suffering so much. I just need relief for a minute. I just need something to make me feel a little better. And not dying feels better than dying. So we go to that. And at some point, everything we're addicted to, everything we have dependency on, made us feel better at some point. And so it's what our brain returns to. Again, you're not having new thought when you're in high suffering states. So you're not having new ideas. So for somebody to walk up to somebody that's in negative thinking patterns and go, think positively, it's biologically impossible, right? To think positively when you're triggered in a negative state. The first thing we have to do is relieve the suffering. So what happens is we relieve the suffering, that happens, it becomes a new sensory trigger. So then it becomes, oh, this thing makes me safe. Then we get triggered again, high state of suffering, relieve the suffering.
Still addiction, right?
This is just the addictive cycle. Sensory trigger, high state of suffering, relief of suffering. And the thing is on the sensory trigger, what we're trying to control is an impossible thing to control. We need to control the right thing. And the problem is most approaches don't approach the right thing. They're trying to control something that's an after effect. We can't remove states of suffering by approaching the suffering itself, because it's a byproduct of the trigger. We have to approach the trigger. The problem is the trigger is unpredictable, right? If it's somebody grabbing my arm that's causing me to have a trigger every time somebody touches my arm, well, we've had a million scenarios in our life that are all sorts of random triggers that we don't think about, sending a child to their room without dinner, or telling them, or kids in school excluding a child. All these things become triggers in our mind that we are not consciously aware of. It's all happening on an unconscious level. So to try and control the after effect of it doesn't work that well. It can work, but it's nominal. It's arduous and incremental is what I call it. So again, what happens when we're relieving suffering when we enter this state of rest and digest. Our systems are on, but not peak. And we live in dependency or addiction in a reward-based model, but it's not really reward. Pretty miserable. It's pretty miserable being an addict, because even those drugs don't feel good. They don't feel good. They just feel better than life felt before. That was the moment I quit using hard drugs. I'm still an alcoholic after that, but I quit hard drugs I was coming down off of a drug, and I just suddenly, I was like grinding my teeth, and I was driving my fingernails into my hand, and I was shaking, and I had a migraine, because every time I did the strike, I get a migraine. And I just sat there, and suddenly I went, how bad was my life that this felt better? Right? It's just, life is so miserable and so impossible, and there's nothing else in that moment that seems like it can help. And so at some point, the drug made us feel better. So there are certain drugs that stimulate dopamine, right? And stimulate those feelings that cause dopamine release in the system. But the goal of addiction is not about the dopamine release. It is about feeling good, but because of the state of suffering. I've worked with a lot of people that have addiction, and they just quit organically. I mean, I've talked about one person that came in that drank every night, came in and said, I realized I've been doing the practices and I haven't had a drink in 2.5 weeks. I didn't even realize it. Because you don't crave the drink if you're not triggered, right? So that's what's making it, by the fact that we're not in that feeling. So you can look at things like amphetamines that do make us feel good, and so you crave that good feeling, but good feeling is our natural homeostatic state. So the real motivation is the fact that we are suffering and we want to end the suffering, right? Which is a result of brain function. So yeah, so there's different drugs are going to do different things, but ultimately all addiction, because drug addiction is no different than porn addiction or shopping addiction or TV addiction. And none of those are causing the kind of chemical outcome that is really driven by. So for example, if I'm addicted to TV and watch too much TV, I'm not getting dopamine. I'm getting serotonin. I feel safe being distracted in somebody else's story right now. Right? It's a distraction, so I can trigger safety and well-being. But there's no dopamine there. There might get to the point where I laugh at something, but I'm not really driving dopamine. Not the kind of dopamine that's going to trigger the insula. I never feel motivated after watching TV. So.
Usually people just want to keep watching.
Right. Because it's the drug, right? It's the same as if I get fired from my job and I trigger fight or flight. If I have a food addiction, I might stop and want to get chocolate cake on the way home. I'm going to feel good while I'm eating the chocolate cake until the cake's gone, right? It's my belief in the cake that makes me feel better. It's the taste, the flavor, the sensory trigger of it. But again, I'm dependent now on the cake to feel good, right? So ultimately, it's going to come up in a minute. I'm going to talk about this overall as a whole in just a couple of slides. So what's happening again on that physical level, our amygdala is still enlarged. We're still subject to fight or flight response. Systems are on it, but not peak, and we're dependent on whatever has relieved the suffering, right? On a mental level, we're just in primal homeostasis, which means we're still subject to external triggers, right? So right now we're in just primal rest and digest. So we're in the same models that monkeys are using. That I'm not running from a tiger right now. I've found a way to hide from the tiger for today. Doesn't mean that tiger won't show up tomorrow or in an hour from now or in 5 minutes from now, right? I'm still subject to that. I relieve the suffering. I feel secure and placated. I might be in a thinking analytical monkey mind, but this is when we're in a fight or flight state, we can't think very well. So it is an improvement. So we should be able to be in a state where we can think. On an emotional level, I feel safe, but my safety is in familiarity. So I'm still subject to change being a trigger. I am dependent on my tribe. If I lose a tribe member or a relationship, could be a trigger. And I am subject to externalized value. So it feels better, but it's really not good enough. Not for humans. People can get addicted to problem solving. You know, for me, like early on in my process, I got addicted to therapy because I could think through, find something wrong, and when I fixed it, I got an adrenaline rush from that. I got actually dopamine rush where I felt strong and felt, you know, so it was the good adrenaline. It was the, oh, I can do this. I feel good, right? Because I fixed something, right? But that meant I constantly wanted to be ripping myself apart all the time. So my therapist fired me from therapy. She told me I was as good as I was going to get. She didn't know me very well that way, but she knew me really well. She knew who I was then. She didn't know what I was capable of. So, yeah, so it really is, monkey mind is just a thinking mind. Because humans are really to the point now where we can be beyond that. Second state, which is, again, we're going to survive. We're not being chased. Serotonin's released. We enter rest and digest, and we enter a state of safety and well-being.